to the computer. Welcome back. This is the 6th show in an ongoing series entitled Exploring the Divine Presence. The title of this particular show is called Discovery, Freedom 2, A New Covenant. This is a follow-on from our last show. We did that last show quite a while ago, actually. We did the last show. We talked about used the term discovery of freedom in the context of Lane Wilder Rose's book, Discovery of Freedom. And man's struggle against authority. And I took the period from the call of Abraham to the Moses and his people going into Canaan and starting a republic as an example of that she had used that to as an example of a milestone in human freedom. Now I want to go back and explain why it is that before we go into the new covenant, which is the next logical step in this transition, I want to review a little bit because it's been a little ways. As I mentioned, freedom requires human transcendence. B.F. Skinner once wrote, he actually wrote numerous articles and books on the subject, but he was convinced that, and he was honest about it, if you're going to take the discipline of the physical sciences and apply them to human behavior and human society, you have to assume that human beings are not free. And so human freedom comes in the religious experience of transcendence. When we transcend the here and now, the laws of cause and effect, you had freedom. But outside of transcendence, freedom is illogical and unintelligible. So in that Abraham's case, he was left his home and his tradition and his family and the civilization, great thriving civilization in Mesopotamia, and traveled to where this voice had led him. And in service of this transcendent vision, he was willing to leave all that he had behind and take his family with him. So you had this pattern that was being first established in Genesis in Adam and Eve. The individual transcendence as a reflection of the individuals being created in the image of God. So to realize that image, we transcend our normal human limits, and then you had communion. You had the transcendence of the limits of the individual between the individual God, between the individuals and members of the community, starting with the family. And eventually you had society and nation, and then the God's presence took the form of eros, which the Greeks referred to, I'm using the Greek term, is the life force. This life force has been animating throughout the visible universe to drive what scientists refer to as evolution. Now, the facts of evolution in terms of going from lower level of organization, higher level is not in dispute, but we talked about that. But the argument here is there's a driving force behind that, and that driving force leads to the culmination, the pinnacle of this process, which we call evolution. It results in this human intelligence, this conscious being, and the conscious being is free. And so freedom is a very important part of it. So I wanted to, that pattern, I mentioned in our 3rd video, I think it was, we talked about the falling away. We call it Paradise Lost after Milton's book by that title, famous classical poetry. It was very long. And it was a classic, Paradise Lost, and then he had his paradise regained, but that's another story. But Paradise Lost shows that the human beings somehow did not realize these ideals. Now, how that actually took place and what it actually means is a dispute. The Hebrew word for sin connotes missing the mark. If you miss the mark and your mark is transcendence and you fall short of transcendence, then you fall into slavery. You fall into, and we went into this before, and there's a corruption in human nature. In the call of Abraham, we start to see a pattern that is restoring this from the individual. You have Abraham is called out. He responds to this transcendent vision where his God calls him to break away from everything he knew and go into a land that he will show him, and he will make great people of him. Well, so he responded to this transcendent vision. And then you had on there's family level. Eventually, with the call of Moses and the establishment of the what I refer to as the Hebrew Republic, and we'll get into that in a little bit. You had a national level example of this trend: individual, family, society, nation. Now, when I say nation, I don't mean nation state. We talked about the Hebrews coming out of, Moses led the people out of Egypt. And Egypt had a unitary state where society, it was, the Pharaoh was like God, and there was no division of authority. There was no questioning his authority. He was considered divine. And sometimes people say, well, the Israelite people in some periods were treated very well. And yeah, because he happened to be in a good mood. When he was not in a good mood, they weren't treated very well. And so it depends upon the whims of the sovereign. There is no inherent rights in the fact that you are a human being. And that was unacceptable to this vision. So Moses called his people out. God called Moses to lead his people out of Egypt, this top-down authoritarian view of where the leader, the Pharaoh, is considered like a god on earth. And I went into that before, how there was a whole religion about it that created a civilization that was pretty much uniform and totalitarian because it involved and regulated totality of human behavior. Now, what does government look like if the people are not divine? If the rulers are not divine, by what right does government have to rule over does one set of people have to rule over another set of people? And that was a quandary, and it's been a quandary for people from the Judeo-Christian tradition for quite some time. We're going to go into that. What right does one group of people claim to rule over another people? And the early Hebrew Republic did not have one group of people actually ruling over in this way we know it in the nation state. They had there's a book called The Rise and Fall of the Nation State by this guy who was a professor of history, I believe, at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And he talked about, he wrote about this tribes without rulers, was how he described the Hebrew people. Because they had judges that ruled over them. Yes, you have Samson, you had these people who ruled over them. But these judges had charismatic authority in the sense that people believed they were speaking for God, so they would listen to them or not. And sometimes, and they may listen to them, sometimes they listened to them, sometimes they didn't. There was no police force to enforce it. So there was an election. People got to elect the people who ruled directly over them at a family level, a little clan level, tribal level, various different levels. And one Lord, a British historian of liberty, Lord Acton, wrote about this quite extensively in his book called The History of Freedom and Antiquity, where he talked about representative government was something very ancient. It goes all the way back to the Hebrews. Greeks dealt with it too, but to a certain extent, but it was a little bit different. So the question there was an argument that there can be no authority without consent of the governed, because the people do not have the right to rule over you by birth. And this is a distinction from the classical worldview. A classical worldview starting from Aristotle. Aristotle was arguing against the sophists, and the sophists thrust him out within Plato's Republic because justice is relative. Justice is the rule of the stronger. Might makes right, and just the people who ruled over people were, for a long time, the military conquerors. And that's what the sophists were arguing. Aristotle argued that no, some people are born to rule.
It was Socrates. It was Socrates, not Aristotle.
Aristotle argued that some people are born to rule and some people are born to be ruled. That ruling is not a whim of conquering one people over another. And somebody has tried to suggest to me that it was Socrates who said that. Socrates didn't talk about one group of rule. That Plato, Socrates, in his response, justice is the rendering what is due. He wasn't very clear on what was due, but Aristotle was the one that said some people are born to rule and some people are born to be ruled. And he tutored Alexander the Great in the fundamentals of ruling ethically. Yes, he was kind of disappointed in the result of his tutoring, because Socrates, Alexander the Great didn't exactly rule ethically. So Aristotle would, but basically what I'm getting at here is that you have the idea of the classic, even the Greek adjustment to the idea of the ancient idea of justice as the rule of the stronger. Even the Greek adjustment to that ended up with some men are born to rule and some men are born to be ruled. So those who were born to rule had a certain education program to prepare them for ruler. And those who were born to be ruled were prepared for other things like menial tasks and stuff like that. And it affected your education program. So this is a distinct, now I make this distinction because putting aside the fact that you had the idea that God was ruling over the people directly by his law. You had the law of Moses. It was handed down to Moses. We're going to talk a little bit more about that later. So that you had the rule of law and indirectly the rule of people who were enforcing the law. And they were enforcing the law through charismatic judges would pop up and they would claim to speak for God, and the people would accept it or not accept it. They didn't have a police force. So that's what we were looking at. And that example became an example to a lot of writers. There's I got a book here. It's called The Hebrew Republic by Petrus Cunius. He was a scholar, and he wrote a lot about the republic. The idea of republic was influenced during the time of monarchies, term what Lord Acton would refer to as the period of absolutism, by the example of the Hebrew Republic. And I talked last time about the first American Constitution, the Constitution of Connecticut, was inspired by a sermon given by this minister, Puritan minister, who was preaching on the subject, and he took Jethro's exhortation to Moses. Jethro was Moses' father-in-law, and Moses was deciding things for the people. People were coming to him, he's deciding, and Jethro comes to Moses, he says, "This is not a good thing you're doing. It's going to wear you out, and it's going to wear your people out. You shouldn't do this." And, well, what am I going to do? And Moses says, "Tell your people to take wise and morally upstanding people, and I will make them rulers over you." And so take means select, and means some sense of consent. So the idea of representative government and the consent of the governed, according to this minister, was going all the way back in God's command through Jethro to Moses to order his people to select. So they had the responsibility, part of the responsibility of realizing your image you're creating God's image and likeness, and part of realizing that is self-control. And you need, if you're going to have dominion over the creation, you're going to exercise dominion in a way like a stewardship over a garden. And instead of an exploitative way, you've got to have self-control. In order to have self-control, you're going to have self-government. The two come together. So implicit in the Genesis account and also the account of Moses, you've got self-government. Now, if you have self-government, you can representative government is the transferring of your authority to someone to represent you. It's not a perfect way to do things, but it's a way of getting around a totalitarian rule by decree, ruled by the justice is the advantage of the stronger, or whoever might makes right, or some men are born to rule and some men are born to be ruled. Actually, this was refuted back at right around the time of the collapse of Rome, when the Christians were being accused of being responsible for the collapse of Rome, because they were preaching love thy neighbor and all these peace things, and Rome followed the martial virtues, strength and military dominance. And this idea of love your neighbor and pray for those that persecute you in peace and all was considered a weakness that was going to lead to the downfall of the military conquest that Rome was so. And when Rome was fallen, they were a lot of scholars, classical scholars, would blame this on the Christian idea of peace. And so there's a whole book about the rise of peace. There's The Origins of War and the Preservation of Peace by Donald Kagan's classical book that is one of my favorites. And he talks about this, and he talks about the Judeo-Christian view being responsible for the rise of peace. It certainly wasn't the Roman view, and it certainly wasn't the Greek view. And once nations came to power with the Judeo-Christian view, they started to export the notion of peace. And now, even today, people who are non-Christians, they celebrate the birth of Christ, Christmas, as a time of peace on earth and goodwill towards men. without realizing it, they realized, but a culture of desiring peace was ingrained into Western's, as part of Western civilization through the Judeo-Christian vision. And that was something that the critics of the Judeo-Christian tradition recognized and considered it to be ready for the fall of Rome. Nietzsche referred to it as slave morality as opposed to master morality. And Nietzsche was a complicated person. We haven't really went into him before. There are some people who believe that his views could be made to be a lot more compatible with Christianity if they were understood properly. You read him, one place he seems to be saying one thing, the other place he seems to be saying the other thing, another thing, and sometimes it's like he's not criticizing Christianity per se, but he's criticizing the bureaucratic institutions that gave rise, the churches and institutions. So that's another argument. But the Judeo-Christian foundations of our civilization is partially responsible for our concern for peace, but also as we came out of the classical period and Rome fell, Augustine became a very important figure as you started to develop a Holy Roman Empire. And Augustine was referring to this idea that some men are born to rule and some men are born to be ruled. And he made, I think this was in his book, City of God, where he made the statement that God did not create men to have dominion over other men, rational beings to have dominion over other rational beings. God created man to have dominion over the rest of creation, rational being over irrational nature. Irrational means none, but he made this distinction of the rational being versus the irrational beings. And Augustine, and City of God, here it is. My son just brought it to me. So Augustine made that distinction in there, and that distinction, though not perfectly carried out, Augustine believed, if you really read that, ideally there shouldn't be any state at all. No human beings have the right to rule over other human beings, but we have the state as a result of the corruption of human nature to rein in that corruption from doing harm, like St. Paul says. The state has the ability to wield the sword to protect the innocent from the evildoers. Honestly speaking, though, it doesn't use it that way. Usually it uses it on behalf of some of the evildoers to afflict the innocent in some cases, but that's another story. So we had this example that started back in the call of Abraham, and it's been one of the foundation points of Western civilization, the Judeo-Christian tradition. I wish I had more time to go into that, but I want to touch on now, you had the Hebrew Republic that was created as the Hebrews went into Canaan, and then you had this rule of the judges. And then you had Gideon, where the people came to him and says, "Oh, we want a king." Or no, that was Samuel. I'm sorry. Gideon came to Gideon, rule over us. He said, "No, I'm not going to rule over you, and my sons aren't going to rule over you. God's going to rule over you." At that time in Jewish history, they didn't believe that human beings should be ruled over by other human beings. You had the law of Moses, and the judges were there simply to call people to repentance and call people to the people who were to be ruled by the law. But the people weren't following the law very well, and it became probably possible, corruption set in, and saw these other nations in the east around them with these kings leading them and these armies leading them and leading their army, and they were afraid that they're going to get swallowed up by these other nations who had these kings leading these armies. So as the people became more corrupt, and they went to Samuel, who they trusted, but they didn't as a judge, as a kind of a prophetic figure. But they didn't trust what's going to come after Samuel. So they wanted a king. And they asked Samuel to appoint them a king. And Samuel says, no, that's not kosher. I'm not going to do it. And God said to Samuel, listen to what they've told and give them what they want. For it is not you that they are rejecting, it's me. So God wasn't too happy. It's pretty clear that the request for a king was a rejection of divine authority. So then he went and listed all these things that the king was going to end up doing, abuse of power and trampling and oppressing the people. You can read the book of Samuel. So you had Samuel appointed Saul, and eventually Saul was followed by David. And both of them were military conquerors, conquering the lands for the expansion of the Hebrew nation. But eventually, God didn't want their conquest by military conquest. So he didn't allow David. David brought the tabernacle back to Gans when he brought it back to the temple, to Israel. But he wasn't allowed to Jerusalem. He wasn't allowed to build the temple. And that was because he had too much blood on his hand, and God didn't want his temple built upon such a bloody foundation. So he left that up to Solomon. But David is by many considered to be the prototype of the coming Messiah. I'm going to have a Messiah like King David. So he was considered a person after God. It says he was a person after God's own heart. But David sent Uriah the Hittite, the husband of Bathsheba, up to the front lines in a battle so he would be killed, so he could have his wife, which you can see. Even someone as great as David, you can see he was corrupted by royal power, and he of course repented for it, and God forgave him. But you can see right off the beginning, God's warning against royal power is starting to come true. And then you had Solomon, and Solomon had to build a temple, and he created a very heavy tax structure to build the temple. But fortunately for the Jewish people, Solomon had a lot of wisdom. He was a wise person. Rulers of nations from all over the land would come to listen to the judgment of Solomon. He was famous for his wisdom and his judgment. And that was an early example of how a godly nation would rule all of the nations, not through military conquest, but through a vision that is attracting people. Through Solomon's vision, the glory of God was made evident. Now, after Solomon, you had his son, and basically he upped the taxes. He says, I'm not going to translate it directly because it's kind of coarse language, but if Solomon's was using a rod like this, I'm going to use a rod like this, because they were asking for relief from the oppression. And then you had the breakup into the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, the 10 tribes and 2 tribes. And eventually the dissolution of the northern kingdom. So the people weren't able to follow the law when it was written in stone in the tabernacle, and they had a temple, and they had God was dwelling in a temple. That was they showed their inability to do so. So then you had the situation where, okay, they're calling for a king. Well, this ain't going to work because this king is going to become corrupt. So that fell apart even quicker in a short period of time. And so, okay, new plan. Some of the prophets, this is one of the clearest examples was in Jeremiah, where God says to Jeremiah to tell the people, I will engage in a new covenant with my people. I will write the law in their hearts, and I will be their God, and they will be my people. It won't be need for anyone to teach people about the law of God and the presence of God, because I'm going to be in their hearts and they're going to know me directly. So this was something that some of the Hebrew people were expecting. The expectation coming where instead of going to a temple and finding the presence of God in a temple, they were looking forward to a time where God was going to write the law in their hearts. And this was called the New Covenant. And I want to, given that run up, the expectation of New Covenant, I want to go into what is called Second Temple Judaism, which was a precursor of early Christianity, particularly the Eastern form of Christianity, and I think the mystical form of Islam too, particularly the Sufis. I'm not that knowledgeable of Islam. We might do something on them in the future, but you had the Babylonian captivity, where the Jewish temple was destroyed and the Jews were taken into captivity. And then you had this vision by the prophet Ezekiel while in Babylon. He has this vision of God, this grand vision of God, and he's got all, it's I'm going to go into all the details because I don't think it actually is a literal, there's a lot of symbolism there. But he had this grand vision of God where you had these animal-like figures and you had a human-like figure in the center sitting on this throne. And they're called holy, God is holy, holy, holy. And Ezekiel was kind of surprised because he's having his vision of God and he's feeling the presence of God, and he's not in Jerusalem at the temple where God is supposed to dwell, but he's in Babylon of all places. How on earth can God's presence be present in Babylon? And this resulted in a mystical form of Judaism referred to as Second Temple Judaism, that eventually out of this tradition came the Kabbalah and the Zohar and all. I think that is misunderstood, but we'll touch on that a little bit. But in the mystical form of Judaism, they believe that the apocalypse, which is people were seeing this military victor of the King David like Messiah over Israel's enemies, similar apocalyptic vision in the book of Revelations, where Christians are looking for Christ to return and lead these armies over the forces of Satan. Well, this vision, the apocalypse, and this more esoteric vision of the apocalypse was not a military vision of the forces of good over the forces of evil, but the revealing of God's presence God's glory or God's kavod. Kavod is like God's weightiness. God, if you're something is weighty, His presence can be felt. So God's presence is felt, and through this apocalypse, God's presence is felt in a way that has not been before, and it can be. And it doesn't have to be in a temple or in particular places. God's dwelling place is the human heart, and that your body becomes a temple. And this idea of a new covenant where God's dwelling place is within man instead of, I believe, was one of the central messages of Christ, if you understand correctly. And institutional Christianity has gotten away from that. But I want to touch upon two concepts in Judaism that led up to this indwelling presence. You have God, kavod, God's glory, and you have kadash, God's holiness. And first, these are two concepts that are two sides of the same coin. And there's a book by German theologian Rudolf Otto. It's called The Idea of the Holy. And I talked earlier about faith being, St. Paul in Galatians defined faith as the evidence of things not seen and the substance of things hoped for. Well, the evidence of things not seen is common in most religious traditions. And he goes into this in his book, where the religious tradition is an experience of the other, the transcendent other. There's some, when you're able to peer behind the veil of normal existence, you can sensual existence, you experience something behind, something transcendent, a transcendent reality behind that makes visual reality pale in comparison. And this experience filled primitive man with fascination, yes, but demonic dread. Oh my God, this thing that all of visible reality is a dust speck in comparison to, is out there and is pulsating with energy, and for some reason, in some way, it has intentions upon me. I don't know what those intentions are. It's almost like you're looking up at the sun and you can't even hardly look at it because it's too bright, and all of a sudden the sun's pulsing with energy and he wants to come closer. No, it's fascinating, but it's terrifying at the same time, because it would burn you up, it would consume you. And so this is what a lot of primitive religions and a lot of religious texts, they talk about a lot of gruesome things going on because of in terms of what this God would do to his followers. And so the worship and there was a dread, but there was also an awe. It's like the sun can burn your eyes, but the sunset is awesome, awe-inspiring. So it also inspired awe. So you had worship. The worship was a result of conflicting feelings that people had towards this experience. And in Jewish tradition, you had God's glory, which is his felt presence within us and within his creation. Weightiness, something is weighty, you feel its presence. And his holiness, which is other, his transcendence. He's not part of creation. He transcends creation. This is a transcendent reality. So you have these two different realities, two different aspects of the same reality. It is inspiring early religious experience. And those religious experience in his first time beginning was beyond rational. It's something you couldn't, you can't grasp it through rationality. It's something beyond rational. And some of the first early experiences took the form of irrational because it was beyond rational, and it wasn't. So it became, and it wasn't always ethical. And so you had people trying to induce possession of these spirits for magical powers, shamanism and a lot of this stuff like that. It may not always bad, but not always good. And over time, religion, particularly the higher religions, and I think the story, it's true, you can find this in all religions, but I think the biblical story shows it the most clearest. The emergence of rationality and ethical consideration within this concept of transcendent holiness. That this transcendent holy God is the source of rationality. Transcends reason, yes, but it's not irrational. It's rational. That's in the Zohar, they use the term logos in the Greek version of it. In the writings of John, the Gospel of John, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and all things were created by the Word. Well, in Greek, that was logos, not word. The English translation is word, but the Greek translation is logos, and that is the root word of our word logic. So modern information theory is confirming something that religious figures had pretty much come to understand, that this transcendent reality is behind creation, is a conscious rational being, and creation came about as a conscious rational act. And that's why we have freedom, because consciousness and rationality implies freedom. So you got as the experience, and I would argue that religion properly understood is particular higher religion. You had to start with the faith, and then reason kicks in, and so you have faith seeking understanding. The faith gives you this touch connection with a reality that is beyond comprehension, but within your capacity as a human being, you seek to understand it. Part of your experience is, what does this all mean? And you can say, well, it's all beyond reason, so therefore we don't know. But as far as we can, we are, if in a higher religion is properly understood, particularly in the Judeo-Christian tradition, is not irrational. It's not, some things are beyond the ability of reason to grasp, but as much as we can, we try to make reason our guide to our action. Otherwise, we are unable to function in the world. And if we're going to become the stewards of this creation, the pinnacle of this creation, we've got to be able to use reason to function in the world. And so science is not opposed to this idea. Science is a part of this idea. And science is something that we become a tool that helps us in the faith seeking understanding. So but there's also the ethical part of it. If we are all created in the image of God, then we all have a dignity and we should be treated thusly. So you have one example. You have this, when I was reading the Bible with my son, and we were going through the Leviticus and all these priestly exhortations for worship, and it was very detailed for what the priests need to do. But the reason is almost like you're getting ready to enter a nuclear power plant. You better garment up. This is what this is when we talk about this. This is what it's trying to get you to take this seriously. This is something that it's trying to engender an attitude of seriousness, because this is a transcendent reality. It's not just part of your created reality. And so there's a certain amount of awe and respect that is appropriate, not because God is self-centered and wants to be worshipped, but because that worship and that attitude towards the transcendent is going to fulfill us better. It's going to prepare us to become the dwelling place of that transcendent. So it's for our worship is not for God's benefit, it's for our benefit. Because the worship and the religious process is part of the preparation for the dwelling place of God to be with man. In Isaiah 11:1 through 6 through 17, Isaiah 11:1 through Isaiah 11:17 verses 1 through, you have a whole series of, I hate this and I'm not going to listen to your prayers, and is a complete repudiation of the whole sacramental system of worship and prayer and formal religion. I showed it to my son. He was what? I said, now, what do you mean you hate all this stuff? You're the one that told us to do it. What's going on here? No, the purpose of that, yes, you do that to create a certain reverence and attitude, but the purpose, the fulfillment of this, that's the form. The substance is justice. God wants justice. He wants us to be able to work for justice. So a religious life that is not committed to justice, is all form and no substance, is abhorrent in God's eyes. If you're praying and fasting and doing all these things and you're have no concern for justice, that's abhorrent in God's eyes. And that's what I seek mercy, not sacrifice. Or there's, oh, God is all over. Jesus referred to these several times. You have now a preparation going on, and I want to end up with the expression of two things I want to deal with. One is the goal of Kabbalah, which is, and I'm not a Kabbalist. I have a friend who is a Jewish Rabbi Chris, Asher Chris, and he's an expert in Kabbalah, and I've listened to a lot of his stuff, but he gets into a lot of esoteric stuff, so sometimes I back off and, okay, what is the essence of this? The goal of Kabbalah is the realization of the tree of life, the true Adam. And in Greek terms, we would call that theosis or divination. The true Adam becomes the complete image and likeness of God. God's dwelling place becomes within man. And how is that achieved? It's achieved through kenosis. Kenosis is when God's presence is completely within you. And that's what religion is eventually heading towards, ideally, properly speaking, is it's not about churches and synagogues and mosques and temples and all prayers and fasting, and it's about the presence of God within human beings. And that's what God is seeking, and to dwell within the human being. And that's why we talked about this in one of the, I think it was the third video, when we talked about the path towards liberty. And we talked about the stages. in Genesis, and how God had instead of being everything and just absorbed into God, and God wanted to see his self reflected in his creation. So in order to see himself reflected in his creation, there has to be an I and a thou. There can't just be an I. Prior to creation. I say prior advisedly so, because prior to creation you had no time. So how can you have something prior to time zero? But prior to creation, God was it. God was everything. Then God started to create. He separated. You separated the earth from the stars, the heavens from the earth, the days from the night, the ocean from the land. And he had these different. Then when God reaches out to his people, he refers to himself as holy. He's separate. And the reason for this is to create a relationship instead of monolithic whole Borg collective entity where you want to have a relationship. We talked about that before. So the new covenant is the place where God dwells within human beings, and human beings become the repository of God's glory, God's presence, God's luminous brilliance. And that is, for now, unless I come up with another idea, that is the exploring the divine presence. For now, this is the 6th, and for now, I don't know if it's going to be the final, but I will look into it later.